Okay, the topic here is Eye on the Prize, Day 2 and 3. Keep in mind, this assumes that you have completed watching the selected videos from the Eye on the Prize series. If you are wondering, well, what about some of the other groups and what laws were designed to target in this particular example here, the Chinese, going back to the 1800s, there are a series of laws that were designed to target this particular group, restricts them from marrying, restricts them from owning property, referred to as the Mongolians, prohibits marriage between whites and Mongolians in addition to Negroes, mulattoes, or Native Americans. So just pointing those particular points out. If we were in class, since we would have watched some of the Eye on the Prize series, I would have split the class up into rows, and somebody would have completed a writing on either of these topics: make a connection to the dream deferred, the or does it explode theme. So if you could think about those particular questions and think about how you would have responded if we were in class. Also in class, we would have continued using this sheet. At this point, again, you should have watched the Till, Montgomery, Greensboro, Little Rock, and ended up with Birmingham, looking for the spark event, the loopholes that were used, and what the federal government's response was in each particular situation. Also would have been asking you to complete this sheet so we have some understanding of the groups and the people involved in this particular fight. We looked at the sit-ins and what would eventually become SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And in the early 60s, these groups are definitely passive, docile, not really going to the extremes, which is why when you watch the video, you saw a lot of these protesters being beaten up and things like that. One of the things the video did not have, only because I couldn't figure out which one it was, is the C.O.R.E and the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides is an interesting one. You should remember from the presentations last marking period that there was an interstate, and that's what this map is showing you, the interstate, that the federal government put aside money to build a highway system. So the question here is, let's take this particular federal highway road right here. It goes through the South, and technically it's federal government property because the federal government is the one that's putting up the money and building this road. However, it's physically located in the South. So let's just say I have a restaurant or a bathroom that is on the rest area. If the federal government, which they did, declared the businesses on the interstate to be in compliance with integration, then the question here is whether or not the state governments or the local governments or both are really following that particular piece of legislation. So C.O.R.E initiates what becomes known as the Freedom Summers, and their strategy is pretty interesting. They're going to load up buses with both black and white, and they're going to travel on this interstate, and they're going to test the law to see whether or not these southern states are complying with integration on the interstate. Congress on Racial Equality, group that I mentioned before. Keep in mind, some of the founders, its members, not everybody's African American in that situation. You have other groups that are participating and trying to get involved to try to achieve equality in America. This map right here is showing you the route that's taken, and if you didn't guess or think about it, those buses were definitely targeted, often bombed. It gets so bad that the government has to put federal marshals on these buses to ensure that these demonstrators were not going to be harassed. But if you follow this particular route, bus attacked, firebombed, Freedom Riders beaten. They arrived at 13th. They depart on the 14th. I guess I was a little off there. I should have been going this way as opposed to that way. Severely beaten, mass arrest, the bus terminal. So probably risking a lot of violent actions and possibly even jail time if you are going to be involved with some of the core freedom rides. And notice how this eventually gets down here to Birmingham. You would not want to be a town that's associated with any of this civil rights demonstration. And so King, going back to the documentary, he knew that Birmingham was definitely a place that had a record of a lot of violence targeting, the black population, and a lot of laws that were discriminatory. So his goal here is he's going to protest in Birmingham, which was nicknamed Bombingham for the amount of attacks that occurred against black leadership. So King winds up getting thrown in jail for parading without a permit, which is a loophole again around his right to protest. Anyway, while he's in jail, he writes this letter from Birmingham jail, and I find it interesting where he starts to identify, the response from the Negro community. He says that some people will adjust to segregation, some people will profit off of it, and some will start to become bitter and have a hatred as a result of their circumstances. And this is the one that I'm concerned with. And this is the one that I'm going to challenge you with as we move into the tail of 260s into the late 60s, where the movement starts to, its members start to grow frustrated. They're annoyed with the amount of harassment and violence and just, the wearing down on, not achieving any sort of change for their particular group. So I have a couple of videos here that I've already queued up. Let's take a look at this one.
C.O.R.E. wants to test a Supreme Court ruling long ignored in the South that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses, journeys that C.O.R.E. calls freedom rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence,
I want you to think it over very carefully, and if you
believing that challenging segregation peacefully will force the authorities to act.
we would be very happy to have you embark upon this dangerous
Organization in America captures these images. The Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside.
Let's take a look at this clip here on Birmingham.
Answer to that one-page ad around the margins of the New York Times.
For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
8 days later, King accepted release on bond to plan the next phase of the demonstrations. That plan would be the most controversial yet.
We wanted to get the black community in Birmingham involved, and the way you get people involved is get their children involved.
They were taking the kids out of school,
So this is an interesting approach. If King is going to have his demonstration, they're probably going to arrest anybody involved until they make the decision, well, let's use children and put these individuals in a tough spot. They wouldn't dare attack any children. And you come to find out
the water hit with enough force to knock the bark off trees. As water pounded the demonstrators, David Vann was on the phone with A.G. Gant.
And it's images like the ones here that really start to get some of the people in the movement to go to some of the other civil rights leaders, in particular people like Malcolm X with the Nation of Islam. And then you start to see the Black Panther Party emerge later on. Again, King was arrested for parading without a permit. This was definitely a way to deny him his right to protest. And you see some of the outcome here. Also going to point out that eventually the integration of Birmingham is successful. And just like, when you're looking at the early 60s, you're successful, but then, something happens. You take one step forward and then 3 steps back. And this is a perfect example here where an act of terrorism committed at the 16th Street Baptist Church that results in the death of these 4 children here. Just pointing out the FBI definition of terrorism. If you're trying to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence the policy of the government by intimidation, I think it definitely counts when you engage in acts like that. Let's see. Again, we have the assassination of King. And again, another thing that's going to create anger, frustration, looking at that particular campaign in 1964, the Freedom Summer, where you're going to see again SNCC and C.O.R.E trying to register voters in the South, and these three individuals wind up traveling there to try to get people registered to vote. And before you know it, their bodies are found in a shallow ditch. Notice how they're not targeting, Black Americans, white Americans, anybody associated with the movement is fair game for violence. So going back to some of the themes here, I definitely want you thinking about that last part, that explosion as you move into the late 60s, the early 60s in comparison to the late 60s, that this is the success experienced by African Americans are going to inspire other groups. The Mattachine Society, you're going to see the New York Radical Woman, which will be the focus in a couple more classes. And that growing frustration will lead to some anger. On the site, there is this timeline where I've tried to sum up the events that were part of the Eye on the Prize series. We started with Emmett Till and kind of progressed through Little Rock 9, C.O.R.E. I'm giving you a couple of dates here, putting them in chronological order. And by the time you get to the late 60s, you start to see other groups emerge, which is why I put the Black Panther Party here, where they start to preach Black nationalism, also about self-defense. So that'll be the focus in the next couple of classes. But I definitely, at this point, want you to think about the difference between King and Malcolm X, and that's why I assigned the 2 readings. So you should be looking at that and processing those particular assignments.